We did conclude our time on the philosophical arguments. I feel a little bit loud, Christopher. I don't know if I am or not. So we are going to move into our discussion of biblical apologetics, so a defense of the Bible and kind of talking about how did we get the Bible that we have in our hands right now. But before we do that, as a quick review and pop quiz, could we, between us, and I'll help as needed, come up with the 5 knocks that we have talked about, the 5 knocks of that demand a knocker outside of the universe.
What is anything exists at all?
Yeah, we just got stuff here. The fact that anything exists at all demands an answer.
Problem of evil?
Yeah, the problem of evil / the fact that we are moral beings. So if there's a real problem of evil, that means there's a real right and wrong. If there's a real right and wrong, there must be a real right and wrong giver, which means there must be a God. I heard another one over here. Yes, mind, consciousness. So we have this non-physical mind that we all have, and where did that come from, right?
Life from order.
What's that?
Life from not.
Life, so life itself, and then what was the last one?
Order.
Yeah, order. The telos of the created world was finely tuned for life, and so those are the 5 knocks. So it's good to have those kind of in your back pocket when and if you are in a conversation. And as we discussed last week, you may have 1 or 2 conversations in your life, if you're not actually going out looking for these types of conversations, that these might come into play. It really depends on the circles you run in and the type of evangelism that you might do. But they're good to have for yourself as well. All right, so those are those 5 knocks. So today, as I said, we're going to turn our attention to the Bible. But before we do that, I wanted to talk about some non-biblical resources or sources that point to Jesus and what he did. So all of these, and you can read over them, are non-biblical sources. Some of them were friendly sources. Some of them were unfriendly sources to the church and Jesus. But all of them mention key facts about Jesus and what he did and his followers in and around the 1st and 2nd century. And if we were to take what we can learn just from these sources, we could extract these facts about Jesus. And I won't read through all of these for you, but you can read through them. And it's a fairly decent summary of what we would find in the New Testament from non-biblical sources alone. Previous slide? Yeah. Here's the previous slide. We talk about Josephus quite a bit. Pastors talk about Josephus. Some of his writings have been questioned, but we have all of these other writings that also mention it. And here are the facts that we can get from those. In fact, if we were to kind of compare Tiberius Caesar and Jesus, Jesus has 10 non-biblical source mentions. Tiberius Caesar only has 9. So if we doubt the fact that Jesus existed, maybe Tiberius Caesar doesn't exist either. When we add in the biblical sources, we get 43 and 10 for Tiberius Caesar, because we get a mention of him in Luke. So when we're talking about the historicity of Jesus and the fact that he existed, even the most strident but honest critics will say, yeah, there was a historical Jesus, and he did exist. All right, so turning our attention to the Bible, if you talk to someone about the Bible, and maybe even some people in here have this idea that we got the Bible basically from a long game of telephone, right? someone wrote down something, and then someone took that and they copied it, and then that maybe that went into a different language, and then they copied that, and that went into a different language, and they copied that. And so, I've read folks say, well, the Bible we have now is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy from, hundreds and hundreds of copies. And that just simply is not the case. So let's talk about how we did get our Bible. So we had at one point in time what we would call the autographs. Now, when you think of an autograph, what do you think of? Yeah, someone signed their name. Those were the original documents that the apostles wrote, or the historians like Luke with, a source as an apostle. So those would be on top, the autographs. And then those were copied, but they were copied a lot right then, right? It wasn't necessarily a serial copy. So we had a lot of parallel copies being made. And these copies fall into 4 major families. I have 2 of them up here. I don't have up the Caesarean or the Western families because they're not as important, but the 2 biggest, most important for us are the Alexandrian families and the Byzantine families. And so if you ever hear someone talking about the majority texts, right, or they're talking about the Byzantine family of texts, because they make up a bulk of our manuscripts, copies of those original autographs. And the Geneva Bible, the KJV, the NKJV, the Modern English Version, all of those are translated from the Byzantine family. And so if you were to, everyone familiar with the Textus Receptus, you ever heard of that before? Yeah, so back in the day, they put together, this text. So even back during King James time, they had 7 or 8 manuscripts that they were working with. These were Greek manuscripts for the New Testament that they were looking at and trying to figure out, okay, if this one says this one says this one says this, what do we think the original said? And that's called textual criticism. We'll get to that. And so when they put that all together, they created the English translation. But someone said, what would be good is if we had kind of what we thought the original Greek said. And so from that, they built the Textus Receptus, which is what they thought the original Greek said.
When was that?
Of course, the King James was around 1611. The Geneva Bible predates King James by a few years. Yeah.
Early 1600s.
Yeah. Do you want to add something?
Byzantine text came in the 300s AD.
Yeah, she's talking
Right.
about the Texas.
Yeah, the Byzantine family starts, 300-400 and moves through. Okay. Then we have another family of texts, the Alexandrian texts, and you can see here I have Byzantine closer in geography because it's, the Ottoman Turkish empires where we found a lot of those. Alexandrian texts down in Egypt, so a little bit more separated geographically, but the ones we find here are older, probably because the arid climate of Egypt allowed them to be preserved. And so I have under here RSV, NASB, ESV, CSB, and most of your other translations, but it would be wrong to think that these translations simply use the Alexandrian body of text. They do rely on the Byzantine text, but sometimes there are conflicts between what the majority texts and the Alexandrian text. And so some folks, you had to make a decision. Do I want the texts that are a little bit younger, a little bit older, and closer to the time that the events happen? Or I want the texts that are in majority. And sometimes those answers aren't always the same when those conflicts arise. So NASB clearly would look at what the Byzantine texts say, but they may occasionally give preference to an Alexandrian text because, based on what we can tell, they're older and closer to the time written. Make sense? Okay. All right, so from those, we got all of our different translation, and each translation Just like they put together a Textus Receptus, they put together other Greek manuscripts that are what we might call a critical text, that they may not match any single manuscript, but they believe is what the original is. So typically a translation committee will do that, or they will rely on one that is already in existence put together by someone else, and then they will translate from that Greek text into English, and then they have different priorities. So you might have a translation like the NASB or the ESV or the KJV that tries to be word for word, right? Can't always be word for word, but we try to, as much as possible, be word for word translations. Then you have some at the far end of the spectrum over here that are really paragraph for paragraph or paraphrases. The Message would be one over there. And then you have all these in between that get different names. You might have dynamic equivalents, you might have thought for thought, paragraph for paragraph type. And it's really the translator's different ways of trying to communicate. Some translators may say, hey, I'm going to give you word for word, and then you got to figure out the idioms, right? I'm going to trust you to try to figure out what these idioms are and do your research and understand what this is, but I want to give you the very words that were translated. You may have some translators that are going to say, some of these idioms are not even going to make sense to you, so I'm going to give you word for word, but when there's something that's not going to make sense, I'm going to put it in a modern way of saying it. So there's this spectrum. The CSB, which I'm reading out of a lot, gets fire from both sides because they claim that they are the optimum balance of word for word and a dynamic translation. Of course, every translation would want to have that. So, moral of the story is, if you're picking out a translation, use a lot, and you can see what different translation committees have, how they have translated. You'll see shades of words, you'll see notes in there, and that will help you get to the real meaning. The problem is, there are words, there may not be one word in English that has all the shades of meaning of a word in Greek. And so sometimes there's wordplay, there's double entendres in something that someone wrote, and it's hard to convey that into another language when we don't have that word in our language. Yeah, Eddie?
The two text
These?
schools that you're talking about,
Yes.
the Alexandrian and the Byzantine.
Right.
So the Alexandrian is clearly older.
Yes, older.
So therefore closer in time to the autographs.
Right.
Do we have reason to believe that because it is older, it is that is closer to the original autographs and actual content? Or do we kind of assume that? I'm trying to understand, is there a reason, is there a reason to think that the Alexandrian is closer to the original or not?
Yeah, so generally speaking, the older a text is, we assume the closer it is to the autographs. Some people have made arguments that there was a time when Rome was gathering up all the manuscripts to burn, and the manuscripts that you would give up would be the ones that, or to burn, and or one was when they were gathering up all the manuscripts to create a library. And if you had 2 copies of John, and I was a Roman officer and said, give me one of them, you would give me the one that had a known error in it. So some have made an argument that the ones in Alexandria are the more error prone. So it's really, it's a bunch of PhDs getting together and trying to figure out how best to sort out the text. Yeah.
Orthodox people can argue about it.
Right, and
neither be.
when we get to the end, I'll show you that there's not, the ones that we have concern over are not ones you don't need to be concerned about it, right? Nothing is in question of major doctrinal importance. Yeah.
The variance is not so significant that
Right.
we're going to, our faith is going to suffer.
Correct. Okay, so really want to talk about, can we trust the New Testament? And the first question in this, answering that, is can we reconstruct the original? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Can we accurately reconstruct what was written? And then next week we're going to talk about, well, just because we can get to what John wrote, is John a trustworthy source, right? So that's another question that we need to ask. So in answering, can we reconstruct the originals, we have two questions on that. Do we have early manuscripts, and do we have an abundant resource of manuscripts? And both of those are yes. So for early manuscripts, here is one of our earliest. So early dating means the manuscripts are written close to the actual events. Next week, we're going to ask a very similar question. Were the autographs written close to the events? So two early types of questions. Were the manuscripts copied close to the time that the autographs were written? And then next week, we'll ask, were the autographs written close to the time that the events happened? But early dating is important because eyewitnesses could refute errors. Hey, that's not what my copy of John says. Your copy of John has an issue. And we have an abundant, we can read Paul's letters and he'll say, read this to the churches around. So it was meant to be copied. And so the question is, how early does it need to be? Dr. Sherwin White says, as a professor of ancient history, has shown via his studies of Herodotus, some other Greek writings, that it takes more than 2 full generations to pass before legend can corrupt what we're talking about. So when he turns to the gospel, he states that for the gospel to be legends, the rate of legendary accumulation would have to be unbelievable given how early manuscripts were dispersed. So there probably was a guy who fought named Achilles. But clearly when we read the account of Achilles, there's legendary elements that have built into that. So that's the type of historical work that folks like this are doing. All right, so this piece of papyrus, you're not getting a lot of text on it, but this is our earliest known manuscript. It's the John Rylands manuscript. These get cataloged. So this is P52. And all scholars believe between 100 and 150 AD. So this is John's gospel. John's gospel is one of the later gospels written. And so this fragment says that the very latest that he could have written would be 150. Of course, John's dead by 150. And this was found down in Alexandria. So you got to think this text somehow got from the area where John was and was copied and got down to Alexandria. When scholars try to narrow this range, they say between 117 and 138 is probably the narrower range for when this text would have been there. And the thing that makes this more important than what it may seem like on the surface is that when these texts were copied, you would have the same words in roughly the same size copied on text, front and back. So this has a front side, this has a back side, and it's almost like a two-sided puzzle piece. And if we were to mess up the words of John's gospel significantly, this wouldn't match the puzzle pieces of later manuscripts, but it does exactly. So this tells us that even though we can't see all of the words that would be around this manuscript, as like a puzzle piece, it fits exactly into our later manuscripts, which gives us confidence that those later manuscripts were not tampered with.
When you say puzzle piece, you mean you're looking at it from one side and you're reading this, and you overlay that on a later manuscript and it matches. Then you look at it from the other side and overlay it on that same later manuscript and it matches. Is that
Right.
what you're saying?
Yes, front and back, yes.
Really?
Yeah.
That's remarkable.
Yeah. All right, so when we look at all of our manuscripts that we have, you can see that the majority of them do pop up later when the Roman Catholic Church started to explode and take off in Europe. But we do see a lot of manuscripts that happen, 4 in the 2nd century here, and then on through. There are different types of these, and this is not necessarily, there's papyrus, there's the majuscules, because those are written in all caps. There's the minuscules written in all lowercase, and then the lectionaries are where we start putting them together as like a book, right? Because at first it's just a bunch of different books. Okay, any questions on the earliness of our manuscripts? All right, so the question is, do we have an abundant number of manuscripts? This picture is taken from my library. Not really, but it does look like that. From time to time, Jill says our second floor is going to collapse, and we don't need to get any more books. So the number of manuscripts, when we compare the number of manuscripts that we have of the New Testament to other early works, by far exceeds those manuscripts. So we have around 5,800 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Okay, just under 6,000. Those are the ones that are cataloged. There have been some recent work in the past 5 years of going to places where it is humid and they're finding new ones, and so they're documenting them and trying to get more of those. The Iliad, 1758, Demosthenes, 200, Herodotus, 8, Plato, 7, Tacitus, 20, Caesar, 10, and Pliny, 7. Okay, so it's really, and these numbers change over time, so as we go and we look, we might find another Demosthenes, okay? Yeah.
I know you're focusing on the New Testament, but do these numbers, are they also reflected for the Old Testament books compared to other books that have been preserved over the ages?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer, but I know that the Jewish folks made copies, and the reason most apologetics focus on the New Testament is because if we can show the New Testament is reliable, will we get the Old Testament already, right? Because if Jesus is who he says he is and he refers to all the Old Testament, it kind of comes in along with it. But then we also have evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls that there was not a lot of change or any that we were to be able to detect in these scrolls that were preserved for a long time versus some of the earlier ones. I don't know if you've done any Old Testament work that you want to speak to.
I mean, you said it. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls are 200 BC. So you compare 200 BC to even the ones he was talking about, like the Byzantine isn't just the New Testament. That
Right.
has the Old Testament as well, and it's the same thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, Andy?
Take, for instance, like Plato, like, he had multiple writings, correct?
Plato, yes. Socrates didn't, but Plato did, yeah.
And so I think you said 7, so that may not even mean 7 of the same writing. Just 7 manuscripts that Plato wrote, right?
Yeah, and this is probably, there should be more probably detail on here. This is, I'm pulled this from a website, yeah. So this may refer to, 7 older manuscripts that they have found of this particular work, yeah.
The point is that
It's dwarfed,
the New Testament manuscript library
Right.
dwarfs
Right.
everything.
yeah,
Every other historical document. I mean, the Iliad is the closest.
Right.
And it's barely.
right. Mitch?
So what defines a manuscript? So is it an original early copy? Like when you said, hey, they made a bunch of copies in sort of one period or even one setting. Like how do you define or how do they define what a manuscript is?
Yeah, so the very word means it's like written by hand. So these are things that kind of predate the press. And the idea was it was at least an attempt at a one-for-one copy of a previous one-for-one copy. So it was scribes trying to produce another book or another copy by hand.
And so were these found primarily in archaeological digs?
Yeah, well, in a lot of them in like libraries of monks, or in archaeological places. There was some that were found, and folks had of papyrus scraped off one side of it and started using there's tax receipts or something on one side, and they take it and they go, oh, here's part of some piece of John or Romans or something that was found on them. So yeah, they go and they look and they find different pieces of them.
Okay, so then that's my last question. So when they talk about a manuscript, they're not talking about an entire book per se. Are they talking about, hey, we found a chapter here? I mean, I know they didn't have chapters and verses then like we do now, but so what would constitute is it just, hey, we found a page and that's a manuscript?
Yeah. In some pieces, in some instances, that small piece is itself constituted as a manuscript, but that's the same for all works of antiquity.
Okay.
And then if you look at I don't know if you can make a difference between these two colors, but about right here, we start putting together what might be in some places called a codex or a lectionary, where we are taking several of the books, maybe not in the same order as our New Testament, maybe not all the books that we would consider to be part of the New Testament today, but at least it was a compilation of books that they would say, all right, here's my works by the apostles. And so that started happening, I'd have to look, but probably this one right here is one of those, because we have some of the earliest codexes in the London Museum, so you can go see them there.
So these numbers are the whole book?
Well, just the ones that are marked as lectionary are composites of several books. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we've talked around textual criticism, but let's define textual criticism. It's the process of attempting to ascertain the original wording of a text. And when we look at the words in the New Testament, it's around 138,000 words. And when we take all of our variants, all of our manuscripts together, we get 400,000 variants. Now, if you think about that, it might give you some pause for concern. In fact, folks try to make a big deal about this, but they don't really have this many variants because we have all those different manuscripts, right? It's like a blessing and a curse. We have to weigh through these variants. So a variant is just a place where I've got two manuscripts and there's a difference in what they say. And so we try to count those. All right, but let's do some math. Y'all may know that I teach math, so I'll guide you through this. It's all pre-done, so you just have to listen. All right. So of the 400,000 variants, 95% of those make absolutely no difference to the text. We have word order, Christ Jesus versus Jesus Christ. We have spelling issues. Our thoughts on spelling have kind of narrowed down. We believe there's one way to spell a word, but that hasn't always been the case. And maybe article differences. So sometimes in Greek you might say the James. We don't say that in English. And sometimes that article is left off. It's just James. So none of these make any difference at all to the meaning of the text. So when you neck that down, we have around 20,000 variants that do make a meaning, but 95% of those aren't even viable. You don't need a background in textual criticism to figure it out. It's like there's only one of them that says this. It's clearly not part of what, it doesn't agree with anything. We just, out of hand, we don't think that was what the original text says, right? Not viable. So of the 1K that remains, 95% of those are solvable by textual critics. So we look at it, there might be some disagreements, depending on where you're at, but basically we get down to around 50 significant variants. And this is where those PhDs, they get around and they argue. And they say, well, I think it was this, and I think it was this. And there's not a settled idea of which was the original.
Are those the ones that you get notes in your Bible?
Yep.
Some manuscripts say so-and-so?
Yeah, you'll get notes on these in your Bible, so hopefully if you'll get some brackets and it'll say, like, there's large sections that we think maybe weren't in the original. The woman caught in adultery, the longer ending of Mark, but then there's also some sections, and there may be folks in here that have strong opinions that those were in the original, and that's part of the discussion. So here's one of those significant variants. This is one of those 50, around 50. So 1 Thessalonians 2:7, but we proved to be gentle. This is, a POE among you, that's the Greek word, as nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children. Could have been that, or it could have been, but we proved to be infants among you, as a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children. And this would be just one letter off in the Greek. And so this is one that's debated by the PhDs, which one was it? You can see that the main meaning of the text doesn't disappear based on what word gets chosen here. Here's another one, and I just realized this. This should say Mark 1:41. Mark 1:41. So actually, I think, does anyone, if you could go ahead and turn to Mark 1:41. Because my guess is we will have some translations that pick different sides of this issue, even within. All right, so CSB says moved with compassion.
ESV says moved with pity.
ESV is moved with pity. I know NIV takes the other. Indignant. Yeah, Jesus is indignant. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, so that is this is a significant one. Scholars debate over this. Was it compassion? And I'll try, this is splegiznomai, or was it being irate? Was it indignant? Was it anger? Or gizo, right?
James says compassion also.
King James compassion. So this is one of those things. We try to figure out which one it is. We're not 100% sure. But guess what? In the end, Jesus still heals someone's hand, okay? That didn't change, right? And so it may affect our thought process into Jesus' attitude at that time, or what was going on. If he's indignant, why is he indignant? Or if he's moved with compassion. A lot of scholars are going to lean heavier on anger. Yeah. Why would that? So think if you're a scribe and you maybe have some ulterior motives. Maybe you're like, I don't know that this surely is not what Jesus did. Would you change anger to compassion, or would you change compassion to anger? You would change anger to compassion. And so some textual critics think, okay, anger is probably the right one because it's the one that, and if a scribe, and we know that some scribes took some liberties every now and then, they thought they were helping things out. And so a lot of them will give the nod to anger, but this is a significant variant. So hopefully you see that of the 50, it's not significant in the case, because we're not losing, there's no major doctrine that's up for debate.
So we can affirm that the autograph was inspired, but we can also affirm that we don't know for sure what it said.
That's exactly right, and that's a good point. We believe that the autographs, inerrant, inspired in what they originally wrote. And then through the copying, and it was a good thing, but it's not that we have 98% of the Bible. We have 102% of the Bible, right? So we just got to figure out what that other 2% is and get rid of that. Right? Yeah.
So when they're deciding
Right, yeah, they are taking into account all of those things, the context, the,
History of the time when those were being written.
right,
There's some that they believe are influenced by politics.
right, yeah.
But if you just read this account, it makes more sense that will be compassion.
Yeah, I mean, that's why there's a debate. That's why this is one of those, would be considered a significant variant because there's good folks with good reasons on both sides that debate this word.
And looking at the Greek, this wasn't simply a Greek, a transposition
Right.
of a letter or something.
Yeah.
Those are different words.
Right, it's not like this,
Right.
where they're very
Somebody
close.
thought the first letter.
I mean, well, these are close. So you can see how maybe a scribal error just took this new off. Here, it doesn't appear to be.
Oh, so they just were two different words written.
Yeah, just two different words written there. Yeah. All right. Bart Ehrman has made a lot out of this. Made a lot of money from what we just talked about today. And in his scholarly work, he's very conserved and reserved. And he would say all the things that we said in here. In his popular work, he tries to take these things and really bend them to show that we can't trust the New Testament. In fact, he's written a couple books. Probably the most well-known is Misquoting Jesus. And at the end of that book, he says, here's a list of the top 10 verses that were not in the originals, so you can't trust your Bible. But think about that. If we know the top 10 verses that weren't in the original, then we know what the original was, and we can trust that. And as Eddie pointed out, all of our modern translations will have brackets around a little phrase. I should look this up, but there's a spot where Jesus is talking, and he says, where the worm dies not, and the fire isn't quenched. And if you look at that in one of the books, that's mentioned 3 times, right? And we have manuscripts, so it's only mentioned at the very end, and maybe someone just wrote that in. We know that those didn't happen in the original, it just happened one time. So does that affect anything? No, it doesn't affect anything because the message is still there. So hopefully, it can be a little unsettling to go, oh, there's some debate about whether it's compassion or anger, and I get that. But that's the worst it gets. So you should be inoculated against folks like Bart Ehrman, who might come and try to shake your faith to say there's some disagreement here. Yeah, but the only reason there's disagreement is because we have all of these copies and we have a rich textual variation that we can use to get back at the original.
Mike,
Yeah.
the other side of the argument for someone like this, if they were precisely exactly the same, then the argument would be we distrust them because they're too much alike. And I know this because I'm on a plagiarism panel, and one of the ways that you recognize that something is not a unique text is that it's exactly like other texts that other people wrote. It's the variation that actually becomes the evidence that this is true, this is sincere from a human being who witnessed it. And if that human being said precisely what every other human being who witnessed it said, you would be suspicious. Because people see things differently, and they remember things differently.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. And y'all make comments and it reminds me to say things that I was going to say. But in fact, that does exist with the Quran. So at some point in time, I think it was around 1,000, but Google knows better than me. An imam who was like head of everything gathered up all of the existing text of the Quran and burned them and said, this is the right one. It's only copied from this particular manuscript. And so while there are still some variants from there, we have no textual evidence beyond that date of what Muhammad originally wrote. And this is a problem for apologists for Islam because we just don't, it's the same thing that you have. We had some artificial tampering with the evidence, and now we don't know originally what Muhammad. We just have to trust that imam who gathered all them up. Yeah.
And I could be wrong, and you can correct me, but I find it interesting. Didn't he go to Moody and then Wheaton College, Bart Ehrman? I think he studied under Bruce Metzger too.
Yes, I mean in the academic world, he's a top-notch textual critic, and he would say he's an apostate. So he, at one point in time, had expressed some type of faith, but says he lost his faith through this, when many others were only strengthened in their faith through this. So, yeah.
So he deconstructed?
Yeah, you could use the word deconstructed. Bart Ehrman, yeah.
When you read text like this, it should cause us to question and do further research. We have to dig a little bit deeper. If Jesus, obviously he was moved in some kind of way. And if he was angry, and we don't like the word angry, well, we want him to be compassionate. Well, why was he angry? He's angry because he's seeing the destruction that sin has brought to the earth that he created. So if we dig into the commentaries and read the commentations by individuals that have studied God's word to a greater extent, we'll understand their view, and it gives us a better understanding of the possibility that he was passionately angry at the same time.
Yeah. The stuff whether it was compassion or anger, I don't want to say it's meaningless, because it would change our understanding of the context of that situation. My point is, it doesn't change the overall arc of the story. Jesus still healed this guy's hand, and whether I could be moved to compassion or anger, and I'm not healing someone's hand. So I think the broader point, and your point is valid. The broader point is the narrative of the New Testament is trustworthy, even though we have 102% of the Bible, right? And then you got to do a lot of work in languages and history, and even how letters are made, and to start being able to have a seat at the table to argue with those other PhDs. So I'm a second or third level source bringing this to you. All right. I thought we would end with a quote, and there's some more extravagant quotes than this. I think this is a reasonable level of quote, because we've been talking about non-biblical sources and we talked about biblical sources, but we also have sources where people wrote, like me, I have some Bible verses written down here, and you might be able to get my notes and say, okay, well, at least this is what Michael thought that Bible verse said at that time. So there were 36,000 citations of the New Testament by just a handful of early fathers, but counting all the church fathers, Dan Wallace estimates there were about 1 million citations. William estimates that 43% of the New Testament verses are in manuscripts that date from before 250 AD. Even when fewer manuscripts were known, the great manuscript expert of an earlier century, Sir Frederick Kenyon, concluded the number of manuscripts of the New Testament, of early translations from it, and of quotations from it in the oldest writers of the church is so large that it is practically certain that some reading of every doubtful passage is preserved in some one or the other of these ancient authorities. This can be said of no other book in the world. So we have a very complete history of the text, and we can compile it. And something else I failed to mention, we've been talking a lot about Greek, but there were early Coptic and Italian and other languages that these were translated in at the same time. So scholars can look at those manuscripts from other languages as a use, what did at least that translator think the original Greek said at that time. Okay. All right, let's close and pray. Dear Father, thank you that you have preserved for us your word, and that it is a bedrock for us. Not only can we trust that what it says is true and what your apostle said, but we can trust that it is meaningful for our lives, and it is help us to live a full and abundant life. And I just pray that we would cherish your word more, that we would live in it, and we would be changed by it. I ask all this in your Son's name. Amen.